In this lesson, we're going to cover radio buttons and how we can bind them to our forms. If you go ahead and open up your passenger form, we can then start populating. Now, what we want to do is actually create a new section underneath of here where we're going to use some radios. Now, our passenger can be checked in or checked out, so we're going to use a radio button to essentially toggle between whether they are checked in or checked out. Inside we'll create a label and we'll just close this one off. Now inside of the label what we want to do is input and then type equals radio. Now the name is going to be checked in, which is the property that the passenger will actually have. And the way that we can use this again is with ng model to decide whether they are checked in or checked out. So again we'll do detail and question mark and then we'll use that dot checked in. So when they're checked in, Angular will then set this model value. Now, because it's a radio button, we actually want to give it a value, and a value typically looks like this. However, because we can use Angular bindings, in this case, we want to use true or false. If we didn't use these braces here, this would actually be passed through as a string. So you can see that this has gone orange. If I undo those changes, it's then gone blue. So this will actually be passed as a Boolean value. All we want to do underneath here is simply put the word yes. Now what we can do is copy this label and paste it below, and we're going to change it to no, and the value is then going to be false. Now because radios have the same name, they can then talk to each other and essentially be part of the same group. So this is all we need to do to tell Angular to use the ng model, and if they are checked in, it will check this radio. If they're not checked in, it will then check this radio. So let's go and check this out in the browser. So you can see from our initial data set, it says checked in is true and our input is then checked. The other one is not checked. However, when I do check it, it says false and our initial data set stays the same. So this is working as expected. Now, one thing we do have is this check in date, and you can see that this is a timestamp. Now, when I click yes, we obviously want to generate a particular timestamp. So we'll go back and add a ng model change function so that if the passenger has just been checked in, we're then going to generate them a new timestamp. We've learned about this before and we're going to use the event binding. So we'll do ng model change and we'll just pass in a function called toggle check-in. This is obviously going to give us an event back, which will be true or false. When the model changes, the event is going to be the value. So it's actually going to give us the value back. We can simply copy this ng model change, add it to the second input. And what we want to do is add this function to our component class. So inside of here, what we can do is simply pass the event through, and all that's going to be is a Boolean. However, to make things more readable, we're just going to call it checked in. It's still going to be of type Boolean, but it makes sense when we do something like this. So if checked in, we want to then create a new timestamp for that particular user. So at this point, we're going to do this.detail. So we're actually going to access this particular passenger, and we're going to create a check-in date. Now what we can do, two options, we can do plus new date, which will create a new date object. Alternatively, we can do date.now. So this will essentially give us a new milliseconds value. So let's go and check this out in the browser and see what happens. So when we go back to the browser, you can see this initial timestamp that we have from the check-in date. When I click no, it checks the passenger out. And when I click yes, you'll notice this timestamp has just changed. However, we're not actually displaying this new timestamp in an input. So what we're going to do is go back and actually register it with our template. To do this, all we need to do is create an ngIf. We'll wrap this in a div and we'll do *ng and then if. Now, instead of using something like detail.checkedIn, because we're using the local form reference, so we're using form.value, if the form.value.checkedIn is available, then we want to actually render out this data. So we can say check-in date, and inside of here we will just do input with a type of number. It's going to have a name of check-in date. And again, if the date exists to begin with, we want to set that initial value. So we can do detail question mark dot check-in date. So if there is an initial value with this check-in date, we're going to create it in the DOM. If there isn't, then we're not going to use it. Now this actually has an effect on our passenger interface. So originally our checked-in date could be null if we wanted it to. However, what we're going to do is actually remove this null value here, and we're just going to say it's a number and it's completely optional. So because we're using a template driven form and the way that Angular works, it will not actually set the null value. So what we're going to do instead is just make this an optional property on the passenger object. So now that we've created this, we are checking if the passenger has just been checked in. We're creating the words checked in date. We're creating a type number. We're giving it that name check-in date. And if there is an initial value, which means that they are previously checked in, we're then going to simply render it out as an initial value, which means that if we check them out with one of these radios, so if we say no, it will then set this value to null because the ngIf will completely destroy this DOM node so that it will no longer exist in the actual form. So our ng model won't exist. However, if we then check them back in, it will click yes. It will then recreate this DOM node, and when it does, it will then create this toggle check-in, which then creates the timestamp for when they were then checked in. So let's go ahead and check this out. So you can see here that we have check-in date and 14907 and so forth, and we have the exact same one here. So you can see that checked in is true, check-in date is now matching up. So this is the initial data, and we're now matching it against our template driven form. Now, if I click no, you can see that the check-in date has completely disappeared. However, when I click yes, it's then come back. We've got the check-in date and the milliseconds are as of this particular moment. So each time we do this, we're going to get a different value that's being bound to the local form. So in this video, you've learned how to create an input with a type radio. You can bind anything you want to. You could create a dynamic variable in a component class if you wanted to, and bind it using an initial value. You've learned how to create a name. We've set some initial data. We've then cleverly used an onChange function inside our component class to actually generate a new timestamp. In a real world application, this may be done on the server, so when you actually post this object back, your server may actually return you the check-in date once it's been confirmed. However, for this demo, we're just going to create it here in the component. So next, we'll move on and show you how to use checkboxes.